Morning. We have one late announcement that George Allen's wife Mary had trouble breathing and was taken to one of the hospitals this morning. So we'll try to keep Mary Allen and George in our prayers today. Today is a special day in my family. 73 years ago today, my father and my late mother got married. They were originally scheduled for Saturday, April the 1st. But in addition to one of my uncles having a little trouble getting there, my mom wasn't sure she wanted April 1st as her anniversary for the rest of her life. No do-overs, no fingers crossed here, so anyway. We've taken a look, recently we looked at some of the Greek philosophical ideas that only insofar as New Testament writers had to respond to certain strange ideas that were getting imported into Judaism and into Christianity as that were not really compatible with the Bible. And one of the main things we've been looking at in recent weeks is dualism, or matter versus spirit dualism, where going back to the Greek philosopher Plato, this idea developed that matter, the material world, was somehow inherently evil, and only the spiritual world had good in it. And we saw that that's not compatible with the ideas of the Bible. When God created everything in Genesis, every time he created something, he said it was good. And the material world's not inherently evil. We can abuse it, we can sin, we can be greedy, we can be lustful, we can be distracted by the material world, but the material world's not inherently evil. And we saw that when people tried to blend that idea with Christianity, they had big problems. In the first century, what were called the proto-Gnostics now by scholars, the forerunners of the second century Gnostics, tried to blend that in with Christianity, and then when you do that, you end up with big trouble because Jesus was the incarnation of God in the flesh. And if matter is inherently evil, then how would that be possible? And so they started to develop the idea that Jesus only seemed to be a human being. He was really just a spirit walking around somehow, appearing to people. So that's, and then of course you can't really have a crucifixion or a bodily resurrection. So it's just not compatible with Christianity. And we saw how, in particular, the epistles of John, we looked at some examples in 1 John, late in the first century, John had to deal with some of these ideas and had to insist. We were there. We heard him, we saw him, we touched him. And this is the dividing line between false prophets and true prophets, whether they will confess that Jesus Christ came in the flesh. Now, Gnosticism combined this matter is evil idea with a second century development, which was a desire for secret knowledge. And secret knowledge appeals to our pride. Wouldn't it be great if you could know something that hardly anybody else knows? You be in on the secret. But second century Gnosticism doesn't really influence the Bible directly because it was second century. However, you might have been exposed in recent decades to this idea that there were lost books of the Bible and that there were gospels that have been excluded from the Bible and that we're missing some of the gospels and so on. And actually, when you look into them, most of these so-called gospels, as we'll see, first of all, they're not really gospels because they're not like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're not really about Jesus and his life and teachings combined. But also, they are incompatible with Christianity because they're second century developments that include full-blown Gnostic secret religion, secret teachings, plus this idea that matter is evil. So this week we'll take a look at what's behind these claims. In the 20th century, there were several big finds of ruins in Egypt that included writings. And in fact, there was a whole library discovered at one location, just hundreds of documents that created a lot of excitement. But these were primarily Gnostic sects that were discovered. In Egypt, there was kind of a hotbed of this Gnostic heresy in the 2nd century. They tended to be written in the Coptic language, which is just the ancient Egyptian language. And so all of these lost gospels, lost books of the Bible, and all this kind of sensationalism comes out of these finds. And the claim that, these are interesting things that were suppressed by early Christianity. Well, they were suppressed in the sense that they were rejected. They were rejected because they're not compatible. If you tried to include any of these books in the Bible, then the Bible would be criticized for being contradictory because these ideas just don't fit. However, even though we didn't dig these up until recently, we can see that some early Christian writers, especially late in the 2nd century, around like 180 AD, were already starting to engage with these heresies. So we know that in the late 2nd century, these heresies had kind of come out in the open, and they are referred to by ancient Christian writers. The first one we'll look at is called the Gospel of Judas, and yes, that's Judas Iscariot. We found a copy, and we can date the copy to about 300 AD. It was found in the desert south of Cairo, Egypt. But it was one of the ones that was referred to in about 180 AD, so we know it's older than 300 AD. Irenaeus, an early Christian, wrote a famous book called Against Heresies. And he kind of cataloged several of the heresies that were floating around in about 180 AD and argued against them. And we're about 99% certain that one of the things he was talking about was the Gospel of Judas, based on the language that he quotes. Now, it's not really a gospel. A gospel is a form of biography of Jesus. The Gospels that we know of tell us about the life of Jesus and his miracles, but also about his teachings. It's a combination of life and teachings. This is not really a gospel, and that's one of the misleading things about all this sensationalism about lost gospels, is that none of them are actually gospels in the sense of let's tell the life and teachings of Jesus together. The Gnostic creation ideas. I mentioned before that the Gnostics, if they believe that the material world is inherently evil, then that presented a problem going all the way back to the philosopher Plato. If the material world is inherently evil, then when God creates it, he's in contact with it, and he's going to be tainted by evil. He's touching it, he's creating it. So how do you get around that? And going back centuries before Christ to Plato, the solution was to say that God created one or more lesser beings, and then they did the material world creation. They got tainted, but then the ultimate God did not get tainted, see. And a good bit of the so-called Gospel of Jesus is really an explanation of the Gnostic creation ideas. It really has nothing to do with Jesus at the beginning. It's trying to explain the Gnostic view of creation with God creating these lesser beings and them creating and so on. And it actually kind of skips through the life of Jesus pretty quickly. It's not at all like a gospel. The Jesus that is portrayed in the so-called Gospel of Judas doesn't bear very much resemblance, actually, to the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Gnostic Jesus in this gospel, the emphasis is on secret knowledge once again. And this Jesus is superior because he has all this knowledge that other people don't have. It's not his goodness, it's not his actions, it's not his teachings. He's got this secret knowledge, that the rest of us don't have. And several times, Jesus actually, in the book, laughs at his own followers because they're ignorant and stupid and so on. They don't have all the secret knowledge that he has, and he scorns them for that. So it's just not really the picture of Jesus that we get. But after kind of skipping through most of the life of Jesus pretty quickly, there's a lengthy portion of the book about the Passion of Christ, which is, from Palm Sunday to to Easter, that we're the season we're in now. That's the focus of the book, but it actually has Jesus ordering Judas to betray him, and Judas Iscariot is portrayed as a hero, not as a villain in the Gospel of Judas. So the whole work has the traces of Gnosticism. One of the ideas of Gnosticism that's kind of satanic, that's been around for a long time, is to say that because knowledge is the ultimate good, including secret knowledge, when Adam and Eve gained knowledge by sin, that was a good thing. If it weren't for that, we'd all be ignorant. And so that fits in with the idea that Judas Iscariot is more like a hero than like a villain. See, Judas helps us follow Jesus and gain the knowledge that Jesus wants us to gain and so on. So it's a pure Gnostic work, and obviously you couldn't fit this into the New Testament. Not only was it written in the 2nd century, but even apart from that, you couldn't possibly fit it into the New Testament and have it be compatible in any way. Now, another one of these lost books that was discovered was at this huge library of books that was found in 1945 in Egypt. And there was just an explosion then of knowledge about Gnosticism as these works were translated and studied. And this was one of them, the Apocryphon of John. And once again, we find it's not claiming to be a gospel. It's not a gospel, so nobody should call it a lost gospel because it's not a gospel. It also focuses on all of these Gnostic creation ideas. And it has all kinds of details about various lesser beings that God created who then went on to do creation, and how they did creation, and how they messed up and made mistakes and tainted their own creation. And the beings have names, and they have all kinds of fantastic stories that, of creating accidentally going wrong, and instead of creating another human being, creating a serpent creature with the head of a lion and all this, So this is, it's really focused on the creation, and it's a very, it's a Gnostic view of creation, that creation is all corrupt, and that the creation is inherently evil. And obviously it doesn't really have any connection to any John of the New Testament, like John the Baptist or the disciple John. But in the 2nd century, it became common for people to try to get some authority for the books they were making up by using the names of apostles. So in the 2nd century, you start seeing, the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas and the Acts of Peter and whatever. They would grab an apostle's name, in this case John, and rather than reveal the true author, then maybe that would give some credibility to the book. So this is just one of the many examples from the 2nd century of people attaching an apostle's name to a book, even though the apostle had nothing to do with it, and the book was obviously written in the 2nd century. Now, the most famous of all these so-called lost gospels is the Gospel of Thomas, another one that was found in the big library in Egypt at Nag Hammadi. Now, this one is the closest to being a gospel because at least it doesn't have any Gnostic creation story in it, and it's all focused on Jesus, but it's a collection of sayings. There's no activity, there's no narrative of Jesus. It's a collection of sayings. Now, in the ancient world, followers of a teacher would often write down the sayings of the teacher, and you would tend to get books that were nothing but collections of sayings. You know, we have that for Confucius in China, and we have that, you know, we think that early Christians, before the Gospels were even written down, had been writing down sayings of Jesus as they listened to him, and that contributed in a positive way to the accuracy of the Gospels, that they were writing down sayings, because that's what people did when they followed a teacher. But these sayings starts out claiming to be secret sayings of Jesus. Now, in fact, that's a little bit false, because as we'll see, some of them are simply copied from the Gospels, so they're not a secret in any way. But it begins, "These are the secret words which the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote them down." Now, Didymus, we know from the Gospels, that's a word that just means a twin. So in the Gospels, when it introduces the apostles, the disciples when they were called by Jesus, in one Gospel it mentions Thomas, who was called Didymus. In other words, Thomas was a twin, and so he was called the twin, you know, as a nickname. It's not really a name like it's being used here, it's really just a nickname. And this idea of attaching the name Judas as if it were one of his names can only be traced back to Syria in the 2nd century in kind of a heretical sect that wasn't Gnostic, that seems to have influenced this. So anyway, it's claiming to be the Apostle Thomas and claiming that he wrote down these secret sayings of Jesus. And so the whole book has, you know, unlike the Bible where we didn't number our verses and chapters and so on until centuries later, the manuscripts we have of the Gospel of Thomas have a number and then a saying, and a number and a saying. It goes from 1 to 114. There's 114 sayings of Jesus, and they're not in any particular order. They're not grouped topically or chronologically or anything. It's just a sayings collection. Now, at least it's more subtle. The Gnosticism in it is a little more subtle than in those wild creation story ones that we talked about. And about 25% of the book seems to be borrowed straight from the Gospels. So there's nothing new there or Gnostic there. Another 25% sounds kind of like Jesus because it seems like it's imitating the way Jesus spoke in the Gospels. And that has led to some speculation that maybe some of those really are sayings of Jesus that somehow got preserved, even though they flowed into this heretical document. But they don't contribute a whole lot of new to us because they're imitative of the Gospels. All of that indicates that the New Testament had already been written and it was available to the author of the Gospel of Thomas to borrow from and imitate in that half of the book, which fits in with it being a 2nd century document. Now, the other 50% of the book doesn't really have any relationship to the New Testament. It doesn't sound anything like the New Testament. It sounds like Gnostic ideas and so on. Gnostic terminology, Gnostic theology. For example, in the Gnostic world, there's, as opposed to this idea that you die, you're judged, you go to the afterlife, they instead have the idea that your soul has now been liberated from your evil body, the body goes away, and the soul returns to God. And in some versions of Gnosticism, returns isn't really spelled out. What does that mean? And in some, it sounds kind of like absorbing it into this big soul that's God, a pantheistic idea. And then you'll see, here's an example saying where you can see the mixture of Jesus' words with Gnostic words. Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. Well, now, what does that first sentence sound like? I mean, that sounds like the Gospels, right? Seek and ye shall find. Knock and the door shall be opened to you. But then look at the second sentence. When he finds, he will become troubled. He will be astonished, and he will rule over all. So the Gnostics had this idea, if you could gain the secret knowledge, then you'd be superior to other people, and you could rule over other people. So the second sentence sounds nothing like Jesus. The first sentence does. And this is typical of the Gospel of Thomas. It has little nuggets in there that sound like, yeah, that sounds like Jesus. Seek until you find. But then the Gnostic twist on it comes. Then you're going to rule over other people because you have found knowledge, Another example is the Gnostic idea, the ultimate, in addition to secret knowledge, is to find rest from material world conflict. And that idea as the ultimate goal of rest is found in some of the sayings. But then, is there anything genuine in the book? Well, some scholars have tried to claim that it was written in the 1st century, but most scholars dispute that, as it seems very doubtful. It seems to have a lot of 2nd century Gnosticism. Some say, okay, it was written in the 2nd century, but maybe some legitimate sayings of Jesus survived and made their way into this book in the 2nd century. But even those sayings, the ones that I'm calling imitative of the Gospels, don't really add anything new to our understanding of Jesus. They're only compatible because they imitate. And the whole idea, the apocalyptic teaching, the end times teaching, the kingdom of God is coming and God is going to vindicate his people. That was the flavor of John the Baptist and of Jesus. And Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist was part of that heritage. But that's totally foreign to Gnosticism. Gnosticism isn't about living in the kingdom of God on this earth and doing God's will. Gnosticism is about get the secret knowledge for you as an individual and be saved by that. And what I thought was really kind of comical is that there's one saying that uses the word equal, and so some modern people said, oh, the Gospel of Thomas is a sign that there was, some sort of feminism in Christianity. But if we look at the very last saying in the Gospel of Thomas, Simon Peter says, let Mary go away. She's not worthy to be with us. And Jesus answered, well, we can make Mary into a male, and then she'd have a spirit like you males, and then she could be saved. So the agnostic idea apparently is that women are from the material world, which is evil, and men have spirits, or doesn't really sound like feminism to me of any sort. But of course, when they have these sensational TV shows that the lost gospel, they always cover up all this kind of thing. They don't reveal the details. They don't quote this kind of thing. And so, one of the things I always say about all these claims of lost books, or this book should be in the Bible, my advice is go read it for yourself. And as soon as you stop hearing what somebody else said about it, start reading it for yourself, you're going to say, this doesn't look like the Bible, doesn't feel like the Bible, doesn't seem to be like Jesus. You know, there's just no way. But they can make it sound that way secondhand. But the flavor you get is, you know, this is not how Jesus spoke of women. This is not how Jesus treated women. So this can't possibly be a saying going back to Jesus. Right? All right. So we will look next week more at the new these things, and particularly in the Gospel of John and the book of Hebrews. Thank you.